All right, hello, and welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel, and we try to turn you on to great theories of everything, all-encompassing theories, grand unified theories, cosmologies, magnum opuses, and tour de forces, earth-shattering discoveries that you probably don't know about because they come from obscure sources. A lot of times the people work their whole life on a project in obscurity and hit a home run, in my opinion, and are endangered to be thrown on the scrap heap of history. And so I'm trying to resuscitate these people's work. And in this case, we're talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is our 28th video that we've done on the book called The Dead Sea Scrolls Deception. And the deception, the authors are Richard Beagent and Richard Lee and Michael Beagent. Beagent, B-A-I-G-E-N-T. And the deception part is not that the Dead Sea Scrolls themselves are a deception, although I am not completely, have not closed my mind to that possibility, but that the Dead Sea Scrolls, their dissemination was a deception. The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered first in 1947 in a cave outside of Qumran in Jerusalem, or 20 miles from Jerusalem. And over the next 10 years, many more finds were discovered in subsequent caves, and all told, about 800 books or 800 works of something or another, including every single book of the Hebrew Bible, except for Esther. And like 30 copies of Psalms, 20 copies of Genesis, but there's also a lot of sectarian material, which is individual or unique to the sect of pious Jews who put this text together. And strangely enough, that has much more impact. The sectarian material has more impact on Christian understandings because they use much of the same jargon, same type of language, same type of procedures and rituals, and really everything that are discussed in the New Testament, in the Gospels and Acts. And so kind of counterintuitively, it is the sectarian material that's very explosive within the Dead Sea Scrolls. But the international team who was appointed to kind of catalog and translate and disseminate the scrolls, they were mostly Catholic priests, mostly Dominicans, and they must have seen something they didn't really like, something they didn't really believe in, and they began to sit on it, to practically refuse to publish anything. And what they did publish was of marginal importance. The explosive material never, not never, but the international team never published any of the explosive material, a lot of the sectarian stuff, and put on, according to these authors at least, a very shameful display of, kind of hoarding documents and then censoring them, silencing them, and eventually enough of a stink was made by especially Robert Eisenman that kind of legally forced them to make photographs of these things and get them out to at least to the scholars and really to the general public, the interested public at large. And but that didn't happen until the early 1990s, 35 years, 35 to 45 years after the scrolls were originally discovered. And I speculated just about that, and just kind of, by the time they got published, most people had kind of forgotten about what they even were, or if they didn't even know because they were too young to even know what they were, including me. And so, I feel a little bit wronged by this. I could have been reading the Dead Sea Scrolls as a little kid, or at least as a young adult, and but I didn't know about them. But this book also gives a pretty good overview of what's in the scrolls, what to expect, how to look at them, how to research them, and what's the context, historical context that it goes into. So right now we're talking about a little bit of the dynamics of first century Palestine. There thus emerges in first century Palestine a kind of fundamentalist dynastic priesthood claiming either genealogical or symbolic descent from Aaron and associated with the expected imminent advent of a Davidic or royal Messiah. This priesthood maintains itself in a state of perpetual self-declared war with the Herodian dynasty, the puppet priests of that dynasty, and the occupying Romans. Depending on their activities at a given moment and the perspective from which they are viewed, the priesthood and its supporters are variously called zealots, Essenes, Zadokites, Nazarenes, and a number of other things, including by their enemies brigands and outlaws. They are certainly not passive recluses and mystics. On the contrary, their vision, as Eisenman says, is violently apocalyptic and provides a theological corollary to the violent action with which the zealots are usually associated. This violence, both political and theological, can be discerned in the career of John the Baptist, executed, according to the Gospels of Matthew and Mark, for condemning the marriage of Herod Antipas to his niece, because it is against the law for you to have her. And indeed, Eisenman has even suggested that John the Baptist may have been the mysterious Zadok, who accompanied Judas of Galilee, leader of the Zealots at the time of Jesus' birth. To recapitulate, then, there emerged from the confusing welter of sobriquets, if it's French, sobriquets, I think it just means nickname, and nomenclature, the configurations of a broad movement in which Essenes, Zadokites, Nazarenes, Zealots, and other such supposed factions effectively fuse. The names prove to be merely different designations or at most different manifestations of the same religious and political impetus diffused throughout the Holy Land and beyond from the 2nd century BC on. The ostensibly separate factions would have been, at most, like the variety of individuals, groups, and interests, which coalesced to form the single movement known as the French Resistance during the Second World War. At most, for Robert Eisenman personally, any distinction between them is but a matter of degree. They are all variations on the same theme, but even if some subtle gradations between them did exist, they would still have been unified by their joint involvement in a single ambitious enterprise, the ridding of their land of Roman occupation and the reinstatement of the old legitimate Judaic monarchy, together with its rightful priesthood. That enterprise, of course, did not end with the destruction of Jerusalem and Qumran between AD 68 and 70, nor with the fall of Masada in AD 74. In the immediate aftermath of the debacle, large numbers of zealots and Sicarii fled abroad to places where there were sizable Judaic populations, to Persia, for example, and to Egypt, especially Alexandria. In Alexandria, they attempted to mobilize the local Jewish population for yet another uprising against Rome. They met with little success, some 600 of them being rounded up and handed over to the authorities. Men, women, and children were tortured in an attempt to make them acknowledge the emperor as a god. According to Josephus, not a man gave in or came near to saying it. And he adds, but nothing amazed the spectators as much, quote, but nothing amazed the spectators as much as the behavior of young children, for not one of them could be constrained to call Caesar Lord. So far did the strength of a brave spirit prevail over the weakness of their little bodies. Here again is that strain of fanatical dedication. That's the end of the quote. Here again is that strain of fanatical dedication, a dedication that cannot be political in nature, that can only be religious. So this is a major theme here, that the Caesars cannot get them to call them Lord. These zealous Jews. More than 60 years after the war that left Jerusalem and the temple in ruins, the Holy Land erupted again in a new revolt, led by the charismatic messianic figure known as Simeon Bar Kokhba, the son of the star, according to Eisenman. The terminology suggests that Simeon was in reality descended by blood from the zealot leaders of the previous century. In any case, the image of the star had certainly figured prominently among them during the period culminating with the first revolt. And, as we have noticed, the same image figures repeatedly in the Dead Sea Scrolls. This author is not mentioning this, but it also is fundamental to Rabbinic Judaism, which was the kind of detailed law, dissecting texts form of Judaism that came about also here at the end of the first century, throughout the first century, but especially at the end of the first century with this guy, Yohanan ben Zakkai, and he also not only did he give the star prophecy, but he altered, what was I getting at? This star prophecy, which is where you tell the emperor, you predict that they're going to eventually become emperor, or that a leader, somebody will eventually be a leader, and then they do. And like I said yesterday, Josephus did that with Emperor Vespasian, which eventually got Vespasian to adopt Josephus as a son and have him live at the court at Rome for the last 25 or 30 years of his life. And this also happens with not only in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but also in Rabbinic Judaism. He gave the star prophecy to Ben Zakkai, gave it to, I don't know if it was Titus, but then he got funded by the Romans. So what I'm saying is that Rabbinic Judaism was also sponsored by the Romans. So, and as we have noted, the same image figures repeatedly in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It derives ultimately from a prophecy in the book of Numbers, 24, verse 17, quote, "A star from Jacob takes the leadership A scepter arises from Israel. The war rule invokes this prophecy and declares that the war rule is part of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and declares that the star or the Messiah will, together with the poor or the righteous, repel invading armies. Eisenman has found this star prophecy in two other crucial places in the Qumran literature. One, the Damascus document, is particularly graphic. The star is the interpreter of the law, who shall come to Damascus, as it is written, the scepter is the prince. Josephus, as well as Roman historians such as Suetonius and Tacitus, reports how a prophecy was current in the Holy Land during the 1st century AD, to the effect that from Judea would go forth men destined to rule the world. Now, just again, remind yourself that Josephus is the son of the Roman emperor, adopted son of the Roman emperor, and is a member of the court at Rome. Suetonius and Tacitus are too. At least Suetonius in a slightly later period. But these people are insiders. You know, they speak for the empire. They are not like scientists or historians or anything like that, philosophers. According to Josephus, the promulgation of this prophecy was a major factor in the revolt of AD 66. And needless to say, the star prophecy finds its way into Christian tradition as the Star of Bethlehem, which heralds Jesus' birth. As son of the star, then, Simeon Bar Kokhba enjoyed an illustrious symbolic pedigree. That is not really my understanding of the star prophecy. I understand it as you are predicting that somebody is going to eventually become the emperor or the leader of some kind. Now, the book of Numbers 24:17, a star from Jacob takes the leadership. A scepter arises from Israel. So I don't see him kind of emphasize, or really, I haven't looked at the Eisenman, but neither of them are like referring enough, I think, to the concept of leadership there. Both for Josephus and Ben Zakkai, who's not even mentioned, and then, but they're mentioning that Simeon Bar Kokhba enjoyed this symbolic pedigree, is what it says. Unlike the revolt of AD 66, Simeon's insurrection, commencing in AD 132, was no ill-organized conflagration resulting, so to speak, from spontaneous combustion. On the contrary, much prolonged and careful planning went into the enterprise. Jewish smiths and craftsmen pressed into Roman service would, for example, deliberately forge slightly substandard weapons. While these were rejected by the Romans, they would be collected and stored for use by the rebels. From the war of the previous century, Simeon had also learned that there was no point in capturing and holding fortresses such as Masada. To defeat the Romans, a campaign based on mobility, on hit-and-run tactics, would be necessary. This led to the construction of vast underground networks of rooms, corridors, and tunnels. In the period prior to the revolt, Simeon used these networks for training. Subsequently, once hostilities had begun, they served as bases and staging areas, enabling the rebels to launch a sudden lightning assault, then disappear. The kind of ambush with which American soldiers, to their cost, became familiar during the war in Vietnam. But Simeon did not confine himself solely to guerrilla operations. His army included many volunteers from abroad, many mercenaries and professional soldiers with considerable military experience. Indeed, surviving records discovered by archaeologists have revealed that a number of Simeon's officers and staff spoke only Greek. With such well-trained forces at his disposal, he could, on occasion, meet the Romans in pitched battle. Within the first year of the revolt, Simeon had destroyed at least one complete Roman legion and probably a second. Palestine had been effectively cleared of Roman troops. Jerusalem had been recaptured and a Judaic administration installed there. The campaign came within a hair's breadth of total success. It failed primarily because Simeon was let down by his expected allies. According to his overall grand design, his troops were to be supported by forces from Persia, where a great many Jews still resided and enjoyed the sympathetic favor of the reigning dynasty. Just when Simeon most needed these reinforcements, however, Persia itself was invaded from the north by marauding hill tribes, who effectively pinned down the Persian resources, leaving Simeon bereft of his promised support. In Syria, safely outside Palestine, the Romans regrouped under the personal leadership of the Emperor Hadrian, with Julius Severus, formerly governor of Britain, as his second in command. Another full-scale invasion ensued, involving as many as 12 legions, some 80,000 troops. In a two-pronged advance, they fought their way from post to post down the entire length of the Holy Land. Eventually, Simeon was cornered, making his last stand at Batir, his headquarters a few miles west of Jerusalem in AD 135. During the entire course of the revolt, Simeon's troops were in constant occupation of Qumran. Coins found in the ruins attest to their presence in what would, after all, have been a site of considerable strategic importance. It is thus possible, despite the claims of Father DeVoe, the leader of the international team, that some, at least, of the Dead Sea Scrolls were deposited in Qumran as late as Simeon's time. Most scholars think that the Dead Sea Scrolls were deposited in Qumran in 68 AD, as opposed to 135 AD, which was Simeon's time. So that would be a big deal. And that's the end of chapter 14. Chapter 15 is called Zealot Suicide. Once the broad messianic movement of first century Palestine is seen in perspective, and once the apparently diverse sects are seen as integral parts of it, a number of hitherto inexplicable elements and anomalies slip into place. Thus, for example, the apocalyptic and eschatological ferocity of John the Baptist begins to make sense, as does his role in the events recounted by the Gospels. Thus, too, can one account for a number of theologically awkward passages and incidents pertaining to Jesus' own career. There is, as we have noted, at least one zealot in his following and possibly more. There is the violence of his action in overturning the tables of the money changers at the temple. There is his execution not by Judaic but by Roman authorities in a fashion specifically reserved for political offenders. There are numerous other instances which the authors of this book have examined at length elsewhere. Finally, there are Jesus' own words. Do not, quote Matthew 10, 34 and 35. Do not suppose that I have come to bring peace to the earth. It is not peace I have come to bring, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, a daughter against her mother. And more tellingly still, in unmistakably Qumranic phraseology, quote, "Do not imagine that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to complete or fulfill them. Not one dot, not one little stroke shall disappear from the law until its purpose is achieved. Therefore, the man who infringes even one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be considered the least in the kingdom of heaven." And that's also in Matthew chapter 5, verse 17 to 19. In this passage, it is almost as if Jesus had anticipated Paul's advent. Certainly, he could not have warned against it any more specifically. By the standards he lays down, Paul's status in the kingdom of heaven cannot be much higher than that of official pariah in residence. Another anomaly that emerges in a fresh light is the fortress of Masada and the character and mentality of its tenacious defenders. When the Holy Land rose in revolt in AD 66, Masada was one of the first strongholds to be seized by Menachem, the son or grandson of Judas of Galilee, founder of the Zealots. Perched high on a sheer-sided mountain overlooking the southwestern shore of the Dead Sea, some 33 miles below Qumran, the place became the rebels' most important bastion, the supreme symbol and embodiment of resistance. Long after that resistance had collapsed elsewhere, Masada continued to hold out. Jerusalem, for example, was occupied and razed within 2 years of the insurrection's outbreak in AD 68. Masada remained impregnable, however, until AD 74. From within its walls, some 960 defenders withstood repeated assaults and a full-scale siege by a Roman army estimated to have numbered 15,000. Now, again, I believe the authors are getting all their information here from Josephus. So take all of it with a grain of salt. Despite the tenacity of this resistance, Masada's position by the middle of April AD 74 had become hopeless. Cut off from reinforcement, entirely encircled by Roman troops, the garrison no longer had any prospect of withstanding a general assault. The besieging Romans, after bombarding the fortress with heavy siege machinery, had constructed an immense ramp running up the mountainside and, on the night of April 15th, prepared for their final onslaught. The garrison, under the command of Eleazar ben Jair, Jair, came to their own decision. The men killed their wives and children. 10 men were then chosen to kill their comrades. Having done so, they proceeded to draw lots, choosing one to dispatch the remaining 9. After he had performed this task, he set fire to what remained of the buildings in the fortress and killed himself. Now, you can definitely question this narrative because this is definitely in Josephus. But in addition, in Josephus is a story where Josephus, as one of the commanders of the Israeli army at the time before he defected, he was involved in a situation where 40 men were trapped underground, and they did this drawing lots to see who would kill each other. And he successfully drew lots till there were only 2 people left, and he was one of them. And then at that time they decided to just forget it, and they didn't kill each other or whatever, and they both survived. Or I'm not sure if they both survived, but just Josephus survived the whole ordeal. So he tells that story and he tells this story. So you can say, I guess, they're you know, these zealous Jews were just consistent with how they went about committing suicide. But I would question that. Altogether, 960 men, women, and children perished. When the Romans burst through the gate the following morning, they found only corpses amid the ruins. 2 women and 5 children escaped the carnage, supposedly having hidden in the water conduits under the fortress, while the rest of the garrison killed themselves. Josephus recounts the testimony of one of the women, drawing, he says, on her interrogation by Roman officers. According to Josephus, she furnished a detailed account of what transpired on the last night of the siege. If this account is to be believed, in parentheses, he says, and there is no reason why it shouldn't. I can think of several reasons why it shouldn't. Eleazar, the commander of the fortress, exhorted his followers to their mass suicide by his charismatic and persuasive eloquence. Quote, ever since primitive man began to think, the words of our ancestors and of the gods, supported by the actions and spirits of our forefathers, have constantly impressed on us that life is the calamity for man, not death. Death gives freedom to our souls and lets them depart to their own pure home, where they will know nothing of any calamity, but while they are confined within a mortal body. Okay, let's keep going, see if I can get through this quote. Within a mortal body and share its miseries, in strict truth they are dead. For association of the divine with the mortal is most improper. Certainly the soul can do a great deal when imprisoned in the body. It makes the body its own organ of sense, moving it invisibly and impelling it in its actions further than mortal nature can reach. But when freed from the weight that drags it down to earth and is hung about it, the soul returns to its own place. Then, in truth, it partakes of a blessed power and an utterly unfettered strength, remaining as invisible to human eyes as God himself. Not even while it is in the body can it be viewed. It enters undetected and departs unseen, having itself one imperishable nature, but causing a change in the body. For whatever the soul touches lives and blossoms. Whatever it deserts withers and dies. Such is the superabundance it has of immortality. Okay, we're going to end right there. Thanks for tuning in today. Stay tuned.